Welcome to part 3 of our Introduction to Research lecture. What I'm going to cover in this lecture is where we find the steps of research that we just talked about in part 2 in journal articles, a thesis, and the research paper assignment. As you can tell, I find these steps helpful. We'll try to remind you of these steps throughout our class. So these are the 9 steps, and then I'll provide what step we're at and where we'll find these in our different styles of literature. I am using 2 articles in this lecture as examples of where we can find these steps. You should download these articles. You don't have to necessarily read them, but again, I'll reference these in this lecture. You can find these in our Moodle class. They're labeled like they are in this on the screen right now as Weiss and Niebert 2013 and Lewis 2011. All right, for our first step, we want to identify the problem. So we typically will find this in our introduction of a journal article, and definitely you'll find an introduction for a research paper. But for a thesis, this is found in chapter 1, which is also called an introduction. So what we do in our introduction section of, regardless if it's a research paper, thesis, or journal article, what we do is we introduce the reader to the topic. We give them all the background information that we think is pertinent for that particular topic or research problem. We need to give them enough information so they have a good understanding of the topic and the issue. So by the time they finish reading the introduction, they have an idea of your purpose and why we should even conduct the research. You are justifying the need to do this current study. I'll talk a little bit more about the introduction in next week's lecture. Then our next step is the literature review, which you'll listen to a series of lecture next about how to write a literature review, what needs to be in a literature review, and how to do a literature review. But for an article, a journal article, and a research paper, the research paper assignment, this is contained in our introduction section. And I have there, see the Lewis article. I don't have a picture of the Lewis article because it's a fairly extensive introduction and a fairly extensive literature review. So that's where we would see that. Then in chapter 2 of a thesis is entirely a literature review. That's the whole deal with a chapter 2 of a thesis and or dissertation. Now here's an example of an introduction. I'm not going to read this to you. You don't necessarily need to read this, but it's just an example of what an introduction typically looks like in a journal article. The introduction will quickly get to the point of what is the main issue, what has been done previously in the research, what has been found, and then they'll go through here and help the reader understand what is the issue at hand and why we should even research this area. Again, there's typically a gap in the research. Maybe the research has not investigated a particular topic for a particular population in our or subject population, and the authors need to make the justification why we should do this research. And then that moves us to step 3. So step 1, we got a problem. Step 2, we do the literature review. We find out all that we can know about that particular topic. And then the researcher will typically make a hypothesis. Again, a hypothesis is just an educated guess of what we think will happen if we do a particular study. The hypothesis is typically found in chapter 1 of a thesis. It will have its own section. It's not always stated in a journal article. I'll provide some examples where it is stated in a journal article. In our research paper assignment, we'll actually have a section and we'll use the null hypothesis in the research paper. And I'll explain what a null hypothesis is in a later lecture. Our next step is, after we identified the hypothesis, we want to write the purpose of the study or a research question. In a journal article, this is typically found at the end of our introduction. So they make the case, and then they'll end the introduction saying the purpose of this study was to blank, whatever it was. In a thesis, that's found in chapter 1. In our assignment, you'll have a purpose statement section and a research question section. And you're going to get a lot of help to teach you how to write purpose statements and how to write research questions. As I said previously, the hypothesis typically is not found in some journal articles, but we should be able to draw out the research question and the hypothesis by reading the purpose statement. And again, I'm going to teach you how to do that in our class. So here's an example of a purpose statement and a hypothesis. This is from the Weiss-Niebert article. And they wrote, thus, again, thus means based on what we have just written previously through the setting up of the introduction. The primary purpose of this study was to explore the applicability of the SCM to, and ATEP stands for Athletic Training Education Programs, by applying the SCM in an academic setting to predict athletic training education program students' commitment to athletic training. Then here now they provide a hypothesis. We hypothesized that the predictors of the athletic training education program's commitment would be similar in strength and direction to those found in previous research using the SCM with athletes, coaches, and officials. Then they also have a secondary purpose. And a secondary purpose was to compare students of varying years in the athletic training education program on commitment and its predictors. So this article provided both 2 purpose statements and 1 hypothesis. Then Lewis, in 2011, in the second paragraph there, she provides us a research question and an hypothesis. I'll just read the research question, and you can read the hypothesis on your own. Lewis's research question was, the research question that forms the foundation of this investigation is, to what extent do talent identification and strength development interventions differ in their impact on implicit self-theory in college students? And then she'll discuss her hypothesis next, and it's pretty developed there. But again, she's providing her research question and a primary hypothesis. From this research question, we should be able to develop the purpose statement. So the purpose of this study was that the purpose statement of this study was that to what extent do talent identification and strength development interventions differ in their impact on implicit self-theory on college students? So that was their purpose statement, or her purpose statement. Our next step is providing definitions, delimitations, and limitations. Now, definitions, I'll talk about next week. All these three things I'll be talking about more next week. Definitions is how you operationally will define a certain thing in your particular study or in that particular study, how the authors did that. Delimitations is how the researchers have selected their particular group of participants on certain characteristics. Males only, females only, college athletes only. So it's the way they have selected, and I don't want to use the word limit within delimits, but that's what it is. They have set a particular standard or a particular way that you want to group their participants. The limitations are how the study has issues that can affect the outcome of their study. So in journal articles, these things are typically implied, and how it's implied in the journal article, especially for delimitations, is how they describe the characteristics of their participants in their research methods section. In addition, it may be pretty explicit for the limitations in at the end of their paper. They may have a section where it says limitations, so they bring it up later. We know that these things really hinder the outcome of our research study. And for definitions, it's for a journal article. A lot of times it's within their introduction or in other places in their paper. Now, for a student who writes a thesis, there is actually sections in Chapter 1 for each one of these areas. And then in our research paper assignment, I'm not going to have you do this directly. What I mean by that is you're not going to have sections for these, but it's like the journal article, it's implied by the way that you describe your participants. You may be doing definitions within your introduction. Again, you will have a learning activity to help you understand this a little bit more. Then our sixth step, which is the research methods step, which is the whole point of this class. For journal articles in our research paper assignment, they'll actually have pretty extensive sections. It can be titled Research Methods, Methodology, and Procedures. And for a journal article, for a thesis, this is its own chapter, and it's chapter 3. Now, in our research paper assignment, I'm asking you to have the following sections within your research methods section. Sections within sections. You'll describe the study design. Again, you'll be learning about this as we go through this class. Who are your participants and how did you go about getting them? That's called the sampling. Instrumentation, which is what, if you use a questionnaire, did they use a particular scale? What did they use for an instrument to measure whatever the study was about? Now, the methods is also called the testing procedures. If you're doing an experiment, what steps did you take to do this study? It should be written clearly enough so other researchers can follow the method section to reproduce the study. And the last section is the data analysis section. Is how do you actually analyze the numbers, the data from this research, from the data collection that you've done. Again, you're not actually performing a research study in this class. You are pretending to collect data, and you're not pretending to do a study. Here's just a couple examples. I'm not going to read everything here. And so in the two examples here, I have where they're describing the participants. And so in each of them, they're telling us how many participants they had. their ages, if they're males or females, all the different characteristics that we should know about our participants. Again, this is how they delimited their participants in the research also. Our seventh step, after we've developed our methods, we have to go out and actually do the research. So we do data collection of some sort. So in a journal article, this is part of the methodology or the procedures section where they describe how they collected the data. And again, for our thesis, this will be also chapter 3, where we're describing how we collected the data. And this is the same with our research paper. We'll include this in our research methods section on how we're going about collecting data. But what's really happening here is we're just describing how we did it, but at some point in time, a researcher actually has to go and collect the data. What this means is they're doing the study. Then step 8 is we finish the study. We have all this data. It can be numbers, it can be words, depends on what kind of study that we're doing. It can be qualitative or quantitative, which we'll talk about later, the difference between those. And there's all sorts of research methods out there, but for the purpose of this lecture, we'll have what's called a results section. This is for a journal article in a research paper, but this is for a thesis. This is a whole chapter. It's chapter 4. What we provide here is the statistics. It can be descriptive or inferential statistics, what we talk about later. If we're not using numbers, we're using words, we'll provide the words, an overview of the words in the section. What does the data tell us? What did we learn from the data after we crunched all the numbers? What does it all mean? Or this is just analyzing. Okay, we'll look at the data here. And so I have an example from Lewis, just part of her results section. And she provides the information, what statistical analysis she did. She provides it in a table. And she has a lot of different results here. I'm not going to spend the time explaining what any of this means, because that's not the point for this lecture. It's just here's where that's part of our research methods, our research steps is taking place. The next step is, after we've analyzed the data, we have to interpret the data. What the heck does this mean? We got all these numbers. We have to interpret what it means. Again, this is going to be results and discussion section. So it cuts across 2 different sections, both for a journal article. And then in a thesis, it's its own chapter. We will call this the discussion section in our thesis. And in our research paper, we'll provide this in our discussion section, what it all means. And typically what some researchers do, if they provided us a research question, they'll focus their interpreting the data around each research question, and that's what I'm going to ask you to do in our research paper, is provide the research question and answer the research question using the data. And when we're writing a paper, or there's a journal article or a thesis, that's what we're doing. We are doing step 9, which is reporting and evaluating the data. So in our journal article, thesis, and the research paper, we have a discussion section discussing what it all means. Some formats of journal articles are a little bit different. Their conclusion section can just be their final conclusion. So just every journal article does it a little bit different. So we want to discuss what the main findings were, and then the conclusions. And then in the discussion section, we want to go back to the research question and connect it to previous research. So The research found X, Y, and Z as their main findings. So what's it all mean? How does it relate back to what was found previously? Does it confirm or conflict with the previous research? So again, here's Lewis. She has her discussions. She has implications as what this means. Again, you don't need to necessarily read this. I'm just giving you an example of some articles, how this is being done. And then here's the Weiss and Niebert and their discussion. They start off with the primary purpose. Again, they're going back to their purpose statement and then trying to link it to what they have found. We're still on the reporting and evaluation, step 9. In our assignment, we're going to have recommendations, implications, and application. How do we link what our supposed findings are to kinesiology? What are some suggestions for future research? And how can you use this information in your area, in your profession? So here again, here's an example of that in Weiss and Niebert. Now this one, they're asking, or they're telling the readers both implications. So based on what we found, this is what we suggest that should be done in an athletic training and education program. And then they also provide what's some future research stuff that needs to be done or should be done. They're recommending previous research for themselves, but also anybody else who's going to come alongside them and do continuing research, because what we're trying to do with research again is seek truth in a particular area. What is going on in our world to and then how can this impact us as PE teachers? How can this impact us as coaches, as athletic trainers, as sport administrators? How does this research help us to make decisions on the way we do our job? And that's what this section is all about. The research would be really useless to us if they never told us how we can use the information and what they answer what I like to call the so what question. So what if we find these findings? What does it matter to me as an athletic trainer? What does it matter to me in my current job as a college professor? How is this going to help me be a better college professor? And that's at the end of all this, that's what we're trying to use this research for, is to impact the way we do our jobs. Again, we're not going to do this in a research paper assignment, which is the limitations, and a lot of journal articles and definitely a thesis will have this in at the end of the paper or in chapter 5 for a thesis. And these are just some things that affect the outcome of the study or the validity of our study. And in the Weiss-Niebert article, they're just describing what shortcomings did they have that can affect what we will call in this class and in most statistical analysis and in other research methods class, if you ever took it before or will take it again, we want to be able to generalize the findings of our study to the population as a whole. For this particular study, the limitation is they know that they have pretty small numbers. It's a very unique set of subjects or participants. It may not be necessarily generalizable to all athletic training students out there. And that's the truth of any research, on which we'll be talking about through this class, is how do we know that we can take the results of our study to other people that are similar to us. And again, we'll talk about that in the upcoming weeks. So a summary of this entire lecture series in part 1 of the introduction to research. We asked the question, what is research? What skills are required to conduct research? Part 2, what are the steps of research? And then in this one, we talked about how can we see the steps of research in publications. I hope these 3 parts of the introduction of research will help you at the beginning of our class to understand why we do research and how it should impact the way we do our jobs.